Hi. First, I'm going to also thank SENS and the Buck Institute for having me here. This has been a remarkable. It's remarkable to sit in the audience. It's great to stand up here. So I'm Melissa Walker. I'm from regulatory, and I'm here to help. And that always gets a laugh. I don't know why. But you have to have a good sense of humor to work in regulatory, though. I've been doing this for 30 years. Started off on the pharma side. Worked for big companies, worked for small companies, and one of the things that frustrated me, because I'm a kind of a detailed, data-oriented person, is not having really enough information to do what I wanted to do. Initially, it was an information desert. It's better now, and we're gonna talk about that a little bit. But how many people in here know what a regulatory person does inside a company? That's what I thought. Okay. So the short answer is that we get in everybody's business. We are there for product, life to death. We have to be involved in everything from vendors, from research and development, everything. And this is why a lack of information for a good regulatory strategy to be able to execute some of the things that Ken was talking about is absolutely critical. This really, I'm the only one to start out with a cartoon, so the regulatory person has to be a little comic relief. I feel like this all the time because I have to explain to people what goes on in that black box, because frankly, it's not clear always, even to the regulators, exactly how things come together and what happens. So why is it so hard? Really, why is it so hard? You know, you do the science, you understand the condition, you understand things. Why is it so hard to find a regulatory process? Because we have to have a regulatory process. Why is it so hard to get there? Well, as it turns out, there's actually a lot of reasons, not the least of which is there's a lot of stuff you need to know. Now, everything that you see that's popping up on the screen here is a regulatory information source that is currently available. That's not even all of them. That's just all that I could put on the screen. So this is why Graematter was created, actually, is because total frustration with the kind and generous transparency efforts that were going on inside not just FDA, but a lot of countries are now starting to be more transparent with their data, which is great until you can't manage it. And so Graematter actually was created to try to make it easy to find what you need to do. And David's reference to the database, her name is Sophie, by the way. It is an aggregation of different data sources, regulatory sources, so that if I want to know something, I just go and I type in a company, a product, or even a person, and I can see across multiple resources and data sets what is going on with that company, product, or person. Saves me a lot of time, and actually I did use Sophie to do a couple of things here on some of my examples, and so she's wonderful, fabulous help for me. So we're here really talking about expedited. Ken is so right. Expedited gives you a picture that it's faster. But there's a lot of questions about these. There's a lot of questions that were asked and done before any of these processes were put in place. There's a lot of stakeholder comment. There's a lot of legislative involvement for responding to frustrated taxpayers like myself who really want to know why they can't get access to things that will help them and help them live a better life. So these are some of the questions, and I put a question mark at the end of the title of this because I haven't come up with the answer yet. And so what I want to kind of challenge you a little bit with is, here's the way that things are kind of working out, and just think about whether or not it's a good thing, a bad thing, whether you need to make big changes, you need to make small changes, or just completely start over from ground zero. So that's just something I want you to think about. So let's see here. That's my questions. I'm a zoologist by training. This is a leech, in case you didn't know. It's also a medical device. Did you know that? Wow. Yes, it's a medical device. It was first cleared, and actually through the standard traditional 510K process in 2004, for relieving venous congestion in grafts. So it created a kind of a constant, a little bleeding that keeps blood from pooling in grafts. So that was pretty interesting. Genetically engineered animal models. Of course, we've had those mice, rats. We've had all kinds of small animal models that are constantly used as predictive models for drug development, for anything that we have. But you need some more. You need more, especially if you move into devices, because it's hard to test stents on a mouse. So there's no regulatory pathway. The mid-2000s now, the 2000s, and there was still no regulatory path, although FDA had made it clear that models that weren't mice and the things that were already there are going to be regulated. There's a small company by the name of Exemplar Genetics. Anybody heard of them? They really, their mission in life is to create animal models, larger version animal models, that can mimic chronic diseases. They started in 2008, and 2009, FDA came out with a guidance document, but FDA's only concern was animals that would get entered into the food chain. Now, they weren't concerned about mice and rats for that, but working with pigs or cattle or goats or sheep is a different matter. So, poor company, they're sort of stuck. They actually got their development of a cardiovascular disease model done in 2010, and as you can guess, there were discussions, FDA discussions, but they were faced with, there's no door to even go through for this. What do we do? So FDA decided that they should take the same path as a veterinary drug. It must have been a real challenging opportunity to put an animal model into a veterinary drug application, but they did. And a little more than a year later, after FDA looked at it, they said, oh, never mind. We're going to do enforcement discretion. So, do you know what enforcement discretion is? Enforcement discretion is FDA's way of telling you that whatever that product is that they're putting under enforcement discretion, they think it should be regulated by them, but it doesn't rise to the risk level or to a need level for us to bother to enforce it. Medical device data systems is one of the recent ones. Laboratory developed tests have been under enforcement discretion for many, many years. It's about to not be there. So they get to go forth and do what they need to do. So happy story is sort of, for them as far as getting through a non-existent process. There's still no process other than we're not going to enforce. So expedited pathways for drugs, Ken covered a lot of these. I'm not going to read them to you. They really are basically wanting to find a way. They were responding to criticism. They were responding to, you're not getting FDA, you're not getting things through enough, you're not creative enough to get all these new technologies and new products through. And I'll tell you that I'm more of a device person, so if you see a little device bias in here, that's I've spent most of my career in devices. So there's expedited for devices. There's something really nifty called a de novo. So in devices, they have different classifications that are risk-based. So class 1, 2, and 3. 3 is the highest. Everybody wants to be class 1 or class 2 because the bar is lower. Most of them don't need clinical data. That's where everybody wants to go. They want to go into that. But what if you have a new device that's never been seen before? The regulation says if we don't have anything like it, if you can't compare it to something that's already there, you're automatically Class 3. Well, Class 3 is supposed to be for high-risk devices. And a lot of the new technology devices are not high risk, they're just new. So you need to go through a process by which you get an official classification for that device. So that's what a de novo is. And it allows you to not go through a PMA process, but maybe go through a 510K process if it's a lower risk device. Expedited access, we talked about that a little bit. Priority review, this used to be called expedited. Same principle, they have made the language between the drug and the device very, very similar. There's really not a major difference. So how are these working? Ken told you a little bit. So I'm gonna do a little bit more. So I cranked up Sophie and I said, I need an example. I need an example of a product that was new and had an interesting and creative, pathway. So patients who have chemotherapy often can lose their hair. And the chemotherapy that will damage the follicles and cause the hair to fall out. A lot of it's mostly temporary, but a lot of people don't like to lose their hair. So this company had developed a very, very cold cap to put on the heads of people when they're doing chemotherapy. Reduces the blood circulation, reduces the exposure to chemotherapy, and people keep their hair. So if you think about the risks associated, with that particular product, a little frostbite maybe, the company approached FDA, talked to them, and here's the timeline. I'm not going to go through each one. You can see that when they did their first patient enrolled, FDA had told them this is a PMA. They finished their study. They sat down to talk to FDA. And then 6 months later, FDA came back and said, nope, you don't have to be a PMA. You're going to go through a de novo process, which is actually good news for the company. I don't know if they ever actually submitted a PMA. That's a confidential information, but they did have to turn around and resubmit according to the de novo. And the review time actually was not bad, 277 days. And when you look at compared to what the average time for 510K or for PMAs in that time is about 500 days. That's not bad. This is what I would consider to be kind of a success story from a standpoint for the de novo. It's a single example of it that it was good for them. Priority review. So priority review, if you have a PMA device, it's going to be a PMA device, and you get this EAP designation. Example here, magnetic resonance guided focused ultrasound, which was for targeting little tiny pieces of the brain that were causing tremors or causing other neurological problems. And they got the system through on a de novo, on an EAP, expedited, and it was not bad. 264 days, again, fighting against about a 500-day. So this is an individual success for this product, for this company. Well, let's have a little bit of a reality check, however. So in regulatory systems and regulatory processes, you look at a problem like the one that FDA was being criticized for. You're too slow, you're not getting things pushed out quickly enough. So let's attach an endpoint to that. What are we going to measure? Well, obviously, we're going to measure review time, and we're going to measure number of submissions, right? That was what the complaint was about. So let's take a look at that. They actually have performance boards that you can see, out there on the website. Just look at the CEDAR track and CDRH track, and you can find it. So let's look at those numbers. This is a real simple graph. I just queried Sophie and said, show me, de novos cleared, put in the first guidance document that appeared, because you can see it was pretty high. It was 400, 400 over 400 days. And then the guidance documents came out, and that looks pretty good, right? Wow, they got more out. The review times came down. They're staying down pretty good. With the 300 days, you can't look at 2015 because we're not really probably through that one yet, if the average is 300 days. That looks pretty good. But let's look at it this way. So this is the numbers that were actually submitted and the numbers that came out. So about 51 in 2013, 43% of them have not seen the light of day. So what happened to them? Well, they were withdrawn or they were refused. And the 79%, that's going to come down. That's still a little too fresh data. Hopefully it comes down a lot. But think about Ken's point. If you're an investor and you have invested in something and you're going to go through a de novo process, because this is a de novo review, that means you're trying to get a class 1 or class 2 designation and you don't succeed, that means you're class 3. Class 3 PMA devices and studies and everything, whole different matter. So about 50%, not quite 50%, half of the time, these are going to fail. So that this is something that you need to keep in mind if you choose to do this, just like Ken said. The other question, the other criticism that FDA received was, equal treatment, fair treatment. You treat me just like you treat the other guy. In 510K land, somebody has to be first. Because if there's nothing out there, you can't compare yourself, to something else. So there has to be somebody out there first. And the de novo folks are plowing that ground. They're coming out there first. And as soon as they're out there, they can be used as a comparator for somebody else. So, example, ultrasonic or an ultrasound ablation devices was for prostate treatment. Review time was about 200 days, not bad. They had a 450 patient clinical trial that they had to do. Quite understandable considering the nature of the device. The fast follower, who wrote a 510K immediately after using them as their predicate, 22 days. And they had 136 patients in their study. So the innovator in this case had 1 month before there was a competitor that could be on the market. God, I love 510Ks. So that's a little bit of a question for you. Does that seem fair? That's the way the regulatory scheme is set up. There's actually ways you can use it to your advantage, but it's something that you need to consider about this particular regulatory scheme. Okay, another reality check. Regulatory processes, they often get developed to answer a particular problem, and something else breaks. So to give you an analogy for this, so I live in St. Louis most of the time, and right there by the Mississippi River. You remember back in the 90s, was there anybody here born in the 90s? Probably. Back in the 90s, we had big floods, and what happened after those big floods were the homes, the houses, the cities, they built these bigger levees. So they said, if the water ever comes this high again, it's not going to bother us. We're good. So what happened next year? It flooded a little further downstream. And then they built up levees because the water's got to go somewhere. So sometimes when you fix things like you inject an accelerated process or an expedited process, or you inject that into the system, you can screw something else up. And it can have a little bit of a result that you don't expect. So accelerated approval programs. Publication recently by some attorneys in Hyman Phelps McNamara, a big regulatory firm in Washington, D.C. They did an analysis of the Subpart H approved documentation. They actually went down and looked at what did it take for non-AIDS, non-cancer to get through this accelerated approval program. What were the requirements? What did FDA make the companies provide in order to do this? And here's the conclusion. It was all over the map. There was not a rhyme or reason for what was required, when it was required, how much or how little. So is that fair too? Maybe. My favorite regulatory answer is it depends, right? It depends on the product and it depends. I say that almost as often as the grocery store people say, paper or plastic. So priority review vouchers. These were granted and with the hope of stimulating drug development. The GAO just actually had a report out about the success of this, or assessing whether or not this was a success. What they found, they basically said, well, it's a little too early, we really can't tell, but maybe. They interviewed people at FDA, and FDA interviewees, they don't like it. Because what happened, here's the headlines, you've heard of this already. What happened was they got sold and traded, and they're useful for whatever you want to submit for. So the big companies buy them. They submit their other products that are not tropical disease, not rare pediatrics, but it's kind of like a, pass, go, collect $200, get a faster review. And it pulls FDAers don't like it. It pulls them away from their main purpose in having the things to start with. They did not get a rare pediatric disease treatment. They did not get a rare topical or tropical disease treatment out of this. And it pulls their resources so that they have to comply with the time frame. So it pulls their resources away from other things that they feel are very focused on doing their job, which is protecting public health. If you ask industry, on the other hand, they interviewed industry, and industry said, no, we love it. It's great. We think it stimulates drug development because, and they have a little bit of a point here, we big companies pay a lot of money to small companies, and those are the innovative companies, and they get to then use that money to develop and do better science and do whatever they need to do. That's the industry side of this argument. So why is it difficult to go faster? I'm going to come back to this. Why is it so difficult? Well, regulatory schemes lag science and technology development. It's a big process to get this done. If you've ever tried to follow even a simple rulemaking, it is a huge process to get this done. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of input from a lot of different people. The regulatory craft, as it were, is a slow-moving behemoth. It's not something that happens quickly. And figuring out, do they work? What elements of it work? Takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time. And the speed at which these things happen is glacial. So let's talk about, we talk about stakeholders and a variety of stakeholders. And let's talk about an example that I lived through and with, and still living through and with, where competing interests by industry, by FDA, by clinicians, by basic science, they all influence each other. It's an ecosystem. Movement in one shifts movement in another one. So atrial fibrillation is a very growing problem. It's growing with my baby boomer generation. The older we get, the more frequency of occurrence we're seeing on atrial fibrillation. And it's a big problem for causing stroke. It's a big focus from FDA standpoint from a public health standpoint. So, little bit of background. Apologize if, but if you know this already. The heart on the left is normal sinus rhythm. It's the electrical pathway. It's representing the electrical pathway for a normal heart rate. What you see on the right is a representation of atrial fibrillation. And instead of having nice, smooth signals that run through the atrium down into the ventricles, you get all this mishmash, this really confused, chaotic signals up in the atrium that cause it to fibrillate. And you can see comparing the electrocardiograms there. Well, actually, it's probably not normal sinus rhythm, that example, but this is how electrophysiologists, who are the electricians of the heart, this is how they look at an electrocardiogram during a cardiac electrophysiology procedure. And they can look at those squiggly lines, and it's like magic. They know exactly where to go to put an ablation catheter and fix that little area of tissue that is malfunctioning and not transmitting the electrical signal correctly and causing the arrhythmia. Imagine now what it tries to do with the other one. Can't do it. You can't do it. So atrial fibrillation through the 90s was basically treated with pharmaceuticals. That was an option. Pharmaceuticals, at that time, there really wasn't anything indicated for it, so there was off-label use. And they had side effects, and as the disease progresses, the pharmaceuticals can become ineffective. And it causes a lot of quality of life issues, not to mention the increased risk for stroke. So cardiac ablation procedure was very difficult for them to do. The problem was they just couldn't find where to go to ablate to fix it. Now, so in 1998, a very smart physician in France decided, well, if he can't find where to go ablate, then he's going to find where the signals are coming from outside the heart that cause it, and he's going to block those off. And he found that they're coming from pulmonary veins, and so he created a procedure that was adopted and is still used today called pulmonary vein isolation, where they go and they ablate all the way around pulmonary veins to block off that electrical signal. They kill that tissue. So the science has not identified a cause. They didn't know why. Sort of a mechanical finding approach at least gave some relief, but the procedure's not good for long-term results. 50% is usually the best you can get using this technique. But the amazing thing that happened, and I lived through this, the amazing thing that happened was industry stepped in. Industry said, we can fix it. We'll make better devices. We'll give you nice, pretty 3D colored pictures so that you can see anatomy. And big push. And for close to 10 years, every meeting that I went to for Heart Rhythm Society, for atrial fibrillation symposium, the vast majority was focused on what is this new device doing? What is it doing? How are new approaches to do this particular pulmonary vein isolation procedure? And it was bizarre because before that, you had a lot of science-focused, figure out what causes it. Try to figure out find the cause and fix it. But it just shifted. So in 2012, a paper was published by a physician in UCSD. And he had figured out how to take a software, analyze all those squiggly signals, and give a visual representation of exactly what that electrical wavefront looks like. Now you can go find it, just like you can with other arrhythmias that are simpler. Now you can go find it. And since 2012, my next observation is, great, we're no longer focusing on so many devices that are coming from industry. We're now focusing on, well, Now that we know where it is, let's really figure out what is causing it and how to prevent it. So it's a symbiotic relationship between what happens in the science world, what happens in the industry world. But the industry world can overpower and dominate the discussion for a period of time. So, reality check again. Oh, yes, this is developing a regulatory schema or a regulatory thing to try to accommodate a really rapidly moving technology is virtually impossible. It's built to be a system. It's built to be standardized. And a lot of these new products are not standardized. They're just not. And the things that are coming behind it, they're not standardized either. It's going to get worse before it gets better from a regulatory perspective. And a key thing to remember here is that they always follow the science. FDA does some basic research, yes, but they're not, you guys, they're not out there on the cutting edge of it. So FDA, they're smart, but they're not seeing what you're seeing. You need to be very much in an education mindset. You know your product, you know your science better than anybody else. It's your science. So when you think about talking to FDA, they really do like the science. And I think David said earlier that FDA talks to academics easier, better. And I agree with that. I agree with that because it's a scientist talking to a scientist. So education has to be a big part of what you do when you interact with FDA. And you just have to have patience and remember that whatever system that you are transversing was created with old knowledge. And just kind of view yourselves as pioneers even from a regulatory perspective and work with them to try to figure out how to make it work. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that it's being done with old knowledge and information because you know that things that look really good one day suddenly look not so good the next day. Or you discover that the levees downstream were not as big enough to handle the extra water flowing down the river. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. FDA regulators have a responsibility to protect us, to protect the public health. And that competing balance is a hard one to strike. It really is difficult to strike. So this is the slide you're waiting for. What is the solution? Well, no drum roll, sorry, I don't know. I've done this for 30 years and it changes so often it's really hard to be prescriptive, but I do have some suggestions. Complete information is so critical. All of those information sources that I threw up there, that I showed you up there, they're in silos. So your reviewers don't even necessarily have full access to all that information because it's in little databases that are scattered all over the agency. I know this because I've seen it. And I've had reviewers tell me that I have more information in SOFI than they have access in their own systems. So complete information is critical for them and for you to know what they're seeing and for you to educate them on what you see. So really thorough analysis of the system. Just think about the river. Just think about the floods downstream. When you fix something upstream, it really needs to take into consideration the whole thing. The whole procedure, if it's a clinical procedure, if it's a surgical procedure, consider what happens before, during, and after your product is used, regardless of what it is, whether it's a drug or device. We do need faster decision-making. We really need faster decision-making. I'm a big fan of collective wisdom, but we need to figure out how to do this faster. It's just too onerous now to really be able to shift and pivot when we need to. And keep up with science. keep up with what's going on. That's just as important for you to read publications, know what is going on in other labs, coming to these kinds of presentations and hearing the great science that's here and the great experience here. You got to do that. FDA doesn't get to come out to these kinds of activities. So again, educate them, help them understand your product, your science. And then my last thing is, you got to exercise some pragmatism. FDA does. Clinical relevance I have seen arguments over statistical insignificance or significance of something that is totally irrelevant from a safety, a patient, or a clinical standpoint, and I've seen it derail submissions. So I just beg for pragmatism and kind of reality from both regulators and industry. Thank you.
Thank you.